With that, I think we're ready to get started, and I would like to introduce Chris Bradford to get us rolling.
Thank you so much, Megan. And it's so wonderful to see everyone here. I want to note for our older alums in the audience that there are people here who were sitting in my office on Monday at the first ever Discovery Weekend for new admits and members of the class of 2026. It's been a really extraordinary few days here at Morehead-Cain. And I see Isaac, who I was chatting with very recently on the call right now also, which is great. So now we get to dig into these really wonderful questions about the governance of this fine university. And I think I've been reminded all weekend as we've interacted with members of the class of 2026 and as they've explored Carolina, just the tremendous assets that exist all over the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And yet there are very interesting and meaningful questions about the way in which this university and the way in which the broader university system is governed. And so that's what we look forward to exploring today. We have three wonderful alumni of the program and are so grateful to have Barbara Ray, who is not an alumnus, but a scholar, who is a participant in governance, and also Mark Merritt joining us. We're going to start this with Mark Merritt, who's a member of the class of 1979 and served as a vice chancellor and general counsel at Chapel Hill from 2016 to 2018, providing us with an overview of how the governance of the University of North Carolina is organized. We'll then have the opportunity to hear perspectives and introductions from Ray and from Barbara, who will share their own experiences and what they've learned in their seats. Ray, as a member, the student member of the Board of Governors for the University of North Carolina, and Barbara as a very active former trustee of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So Mark, if you could kick us off with an overview, which was one of the most important parts of my own onboarding into my role as president of Morehead-Cain, I'd really appreciate it. And so we'll send it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. And it's good to see so many friends on the screen. This is going to be a bit of a crash course in governance of universities, but it begins with a little bit of history. The original Board of Trustees of our university was established by the General Assembly in 1789. They were actually going back to the first Constitution of North Carolina in 1776, which provided that the state shall provide to its citizens that all useful learning shall be duly encouraged and promoted in one or more universities. So we're one of the few states that has our university embedded in the first state constitution. I think it's fair to say that throughout the history of North Carolina, governance of the UNC system has always been a political football. And for most of the history of the state, the UNC system was UNC-Chapel Hill. I would note that in 1804, when the Republicans took over control of the General Assembly from the Federalists, the General Assembly reclaimed the power to fill future vacancies in the Board of Trustees because they were worried about what the Federalists were going to do with the university system if they kept appointing members of the Board of Trustees. I'd also note that in the Constitution of 1868, UNC was put under the Board of State Education, which included the governor, the lieutenant governor, and 6 other elected state executives. That lasted all of 5 years. In 1870, when the Conservative Party, who became the Democrats, came into power, they passed a constitutional amendment that put the university firmly under legislative control. So since 1873, our university system has been completely under control by the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina, not the executive branch in any way, shape, or form. The board eventually got in size where it had 100 members. It was quite unwieldy. And in 1971, in connection with another redraft of the North Carolina Constitution, The system again was changed. The Board of Governors was pared down to 32 members. It was given authority over all 16 constituent institutions of the University of North Carolina, and all the members of the Board of Governors are elected by the General Assembly. And so really, the history of the current Board of Governors goes back to 1789. And since 1873, the General Assembly has been the entity that sits on top of the authority that governs the university system. There were some changes after the 2010 election that are actually important. The Board of Governors was cut from 32 to 24 members, and how boards of trustees were selected for our universities changed. Prior to the post-2010 election changes, the governor appointed 4 members of the 12 members of each university system's Board of Trustees. So after the 2010 election, when the Republicans took control of the General Assembly, they eliminated the governor's appointments, and 4 of the members of each Board of Trustees are now appointed by the General Assembly, 8 by the Board of Governors, and the 13th member, who's an ex officio member, is the president of the student body at each institution. So 2 takeaways from this. Our structure in North Carolina in terms of how the university is governed is both constitutional and statutory. And another very important part of the North Carolina Constitution that affects the governance of the university is Article 9, Section 9 of the North Carolina Constitution. It says the General Assembly shall provide that the benefits of the University of North Carolina and other public institutions of higher education, as far as practicable, be extended to the people of the state free of expense. And so one of the guideposts of our university system has to be affordable. And that's something that in my experience, the Board of Governors took seriously. So once you have this overlay, how is that authority actually exercised? It's through a system of delegated authority by statute and by rule. The General Assembly created the Board of Governors to run the UNC system, and it did so by a series of statutes that set forth the powers and duties of the Board of Governors. They're very, very broad powers. It's power over the management and governance of the affairs of each university. It's power over the educational activities and academic programs. They hire the president of the system and all the people who report directly to the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is the entity that elects chancellors based on nominations from the president, from a list of not fewer than 2 people who are recommended by each university's trustees. The Board of Governors sets tuition and fees. The Board of Governors sets enrollment levels. And here's what's important. The Board of Governors is given the authority to delegate any part of its authority down to the Board of Trustees or the president or chancellor who are lower in the system. And that's what's happened. For example, if you look at the bylaws of the Board of Trustees of UNC-Chapel Hill, there's an Appendix A, which contains all of the authority that the Board of Governors has delegated to our Board of Trustees, and it's quite broad. So the Board of Trustees at the UNC-Chapel Hill level has power over personnel actions, chancellor selection, budget administration, admissions, and athletics. And so you have this delegation of authority from the Board of Governors to the president of the system, also from the Board of Governors to the Board of Trustees, and then from the president to the chancellor, and from the Board of Trustees to the chancellor. So it's this layered system of delegated authority. And the important thing about delegated authority to remember is that any delegation can always be pulled back. Sitting here today, the president of the university system could pull back any of the powers that the president has delegated to the chancellor. The Board of Governors can pull back any powers they have delegated to the Board of Trustees. And obviously the General Assembly has the ability to change the rules of the game in any way it wants to with respect to this system of tiered delegated authority. But the chancellor is designated under the university code as the chief executive and administrative officer of the university. and has reporting obligations both to the Board of Trustees and to the President, and ultimately to the Board of Governors. But that's not the end of governance in any university system. There are other really important parts of governance at a university. One that we don't think about a lot are the accrediting bodies of the university. UNC-Chapel Hill, the accrediting body, is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commissions on Colleges. In order to get federal funding, you have to be accredited by an appropriate accrediting body. And there's some things that your accrediting bodies do that really affect the governance of a university. For example, one of the accreditation standards we meet at Chapel Hill is set forth by what's called SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges. It says accreditation expects an institution to develop a balanced governing structure designed to promote institutional integrity, autonomy, and flexibility of operation. The other thing the accrediting agencies require is that the institution publishes and implements appropriate policies and procedures for preserving academic freedom. Two important accrediting situations that affect governance. And I know when I was general counsel at the university, Margaret Spellings actually called in the head of SACS to talk to the Board of Governors about concerns that they were overstepping their bounds with respect to these accreditation standards. So accreditation is meaningful in the university governing context. Another incredibly important part of university governance at Chapel Hill is the Faculty Council. It's an elected body. There are members from the libraries from each school on campus. They're in charge of the faculty code. They provide input on educational policies, on curriculum, on student conduct that affects academic affairs. It currently has about 90 members. Mimi Chapman is the chair of that group. And so at any university, the Faculty Council, the Faculty Senate, however it's denominated, is a very important part of the governance structure and a voice that needs to be respected. And finally, I'd call out student government for a couple of reasons. The president is an ex officio member of the Board of Trustees, and in my experience, an incredibly valuable member of the Board of Trustees. They bring a perspective on things that's more campus and student focused. That's important for the Board of Trustees to hear. And then independently of that, student government is an influencer on campus. The input that student government gives is very important to the leadership of the university and to the Board of Trustees. And so they're another important component of this multi-factor, sort of multi-layered governance system. And so as you can see from this overview, it is a complicated system. But the thing that people need to understand is in our state, our General Assembly is given extraordinary power over the universities. And the authority that goes down to someone who's a chancellor is tenuous in the sense that the delegated authority can always be revoked and pulled up to the next highest level. It's a complicated system, and it's one that if you think about it, at least from my perspective, from a governance standpoint, you really have a very complex institution like UNC-Chapel Hill, which is a multi-billion-dollar institution with $1 billion of research, an academic medical center, and programs in 100 countries being really governed by a Board of Governors that's 2 levels removed from what's going on at the university. And I think that's one of the real challenges of our current governance system, is that people are making decisions about what should go on at the university that aren't sufficiently connected to how each one of our constituent campuses is unique and has different threats and opportunities and strengths and weaknesses. And I think that's a topic that at some point I'm hopeful the state can address. There obviously has been a lot of talk over the last few years about whether the Board of Governors has become too partisan or too politically driven. I think that's a fair topic for conversation. But I would also point out that if you look at last year's budget, the General Assembly provided the university $537 million in regular funding and $67 million in COVID relief funding. So despite issues that may arise between the university and its governing bodies, we still in this state get a really good amount of financial support from our General Assembly that flows down through the Board of Governors. I do think that the changes in after 2010 that took the governor's appointments away from each Board of Trustees has tended to make those appointments a little bit more political and our boards of trustees less politically balanced. I think that's another challenge that we have within our governance system. But I lived in that system for 2.5 years, and the point that I always make to people is how well the university functioned despite some of the challenges of our governance system. And that's something that I think we all should take a great deal of pride in at the university. So that's as quick an overview of governance as I can give, Chris. So I'll turn it back over to you.
That was definitely a crash course in university governance. You said something interesting there, Mark. I've been struck throughout my time here at just how proudly and fiercely public the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill is. And I see it as one of the real strengths and differentiators of the university and the Morehead-Cain program. And you talked about the 500 plus, almost $600 million, I suppose, of total funding that flows from the legislature to the university. I'm a native of the state of Michigan. I think the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor is one of the institutions we would consider a peer school. And I think that North Carolina gets about 80% more funding from its legislature than the University of Michigan gets from its own state legislature. And I think it's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we think about the role of the public in this public university and the investment of the public in the success of this public university. So the top level of this governance structure is the Board of Governors. And one of our current scholars, Ray Palma, is our current student representative on the Board of Governors of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So Ray, I think it would be wonderful to hear a little bit about your experience. First, how did you come to the role? And what have you discovered in it with respect to what makes for good governance and the function of the Board of Governors in overseeing the broader system?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Mark, for that great crash course there. So my name is Ray Palma. I'm current junior scholar here at Chapel Hill. I'm originally from Durham. And so for the past year, since April of 2021, I have served as the student member on the UNC Board of Governors, which has been an incredible experience, very eye-opening and very unique, especially for someone at this age, in stage of his life. But a little bit more about how I sort of got into that role. So there is this organization called the UNC Association of Student Governments, and the sort of best way to, I guess, explain what this organization is or does is it's the student governance body for the UNC system. And so then similarly to how each campus, each university typically has a student government that is led by a student body president, who serves as an ex officio member of the Board of Trustees. I sort of am in a very similar situation where I'm the president of this organization, and in that role, I'm an ex officio student member of the UNC Board of Governors. And so that experience, I've been involved with this organization since the fall of my sophomore year, so fall 2020. I started as vice president of government outreach for the prior president, and then I ran for president, and that position is elected by the general body. So each school is represented, each of the 17 universities within the UNC system is represented by 4 students in this sort of general assembly Senate sort of model within the organization. And those are the members who voted on the president. So I was happy to be elected president last year. And so in that capacity, I've served as a student member of the board for the past, I guess at this point, year. And in that role, I've learned a lot. But some things that I've worked on, I've been working on college affordability just in general. I know the system as well as the Board of Governors and just a lot of campuses are extremely passionate about keeping college as affordable as possible. And I think that's reflected in the fact that tuition has not been increased across any campuses for the past 5-6 years or so. And fees have gone up a little bit, but that's typically very necessary to keep a university running and growing. Also have worked on ensuring student representation in the tuition and fees process. Obviously, that's one big thing that the Board of Governors does is, approve tuition and fee increase requests or decrease requests. I've also worked on increasing engagement between students and the Board of Governors members, as well as UNC system staff. And so I'm getting, setting up Zoom calls, setting up meetings and that sort of thing. I've worked with President Peter Hans of the UNC system on a lot of mental health initiatives, including the mental health first aid initiative that is working to train about 10,000, get 10,000 people across North Carolina certified in mental health first aid. And then also working on the student vote on the Board of Governors issue. So a little bit more about, I guess, the position, backtracking a little bit. I am an ex officio member of the UNC Board of Governors, the sole student member who is tasked with representing the 245,000 plus students of the UNC system across the state. And I have, in this capacity, I do have all rights and responsibilities of a board member. However, I do not have a vote. And that has been in place and sort of in the statute since 1991, when the president of the UNC Association of Student Governments first became also a Board of Governors member. And so that's something that has been a perennial issue of trying to, really increase the level of representation and, I guess, influence or decision-making power that student can have. Because a lot of times without that vote, it can be a very muted microphone sort of nature, I guess. And but that being said, I have had to work within the confines of that role, I guess, so far. And so I've really focused on just building relationships with a lot of these board members. Obviously, a lot of the board members are very influential, even wealthy people across North Carolina. And so very relationship-based people. So being able to be at the dinner table with them, have conversations with them in the hall and just build those relationships outside of the boardroom, so that when those decisions are made, and I do have thoughts or inputs or student input to give, that they actually do listen to it and consider it. And so that's one thing that I've worked on a lot when it comes to effective change and policy in general. One thing that I've learned is, I think, the importance of just doing your due diligence, especially at the system level, right? The Board of Governors and the UNC system does have a far-reaching impact across the state. To me, I think no state is better for public higher education than North Carolina. I think arguably, in my opinion, we're even better than any of the University of California systems or University of Florida systems. I think it's very telling in that within the Southeast, the largest employer in every single state is Walmart, except for North Carolina, where it is the UNC system. And I think that's an incredible statistic. In fact, just speaks to the prowess and support of higher education here in North Carolina. But that being said, there are 16 universities and one high school in North Carolina School of Science and Math that serve different students, different regions across North Carolina, different populations, and different community needs. And that is all being under one tent of the UNC system definitely makes for important conversations that need to be had about what policies are being put in place, what policies are being looked at, and what unintended consequences could be of a policy. I think that unintended consequence aspect is really important when it comes to different policy changes, because a one-size-fits-all policy could be great for, say, a Chapel Hill or NC State, big R1 public universities, but could be detrimental to a UNC Pembroke or a Western Carolina, schools that are maybe closer to the border, serve more rural populations. And so a lot of those topics are things that I've had not really considered before, having been born and raised in Durham, now go to Chapel Hill, been in this triangle area my entire life. Really learning about and seeing how different universities serve different communities, have different purposes, different missions, and really work, I think, all together collectively to just make this state the best it can be for its people. So,
thank you so much for that, Ray. And now we'll ask Barbara to say a few words from the perspective of a former trustee. And I should note that there were a range of trustees to choose from as we think about putting together this conversation. And we hope we'll hear from a number of you. I see Tim Burnett on the call, the former chair of the UNC Board of Trustees, as well as, I think, 9 former student body presidents of the University of North Carolina are on this call, all of whom have played a role as a trustee. I remember as a mentor of Bradley O'Perry, who was a student of the school that I founded in South Africa, when he was elected student body president and attended his first trustee meeting. I remember him calling me and me picking up the phone and him saying, oh my God, this organization has a budget of billions of dollars. It's like the same order of magnitude as Kenya's government budget. Like, what an extraordinary opportunity to be able to serve in that type of role. Barbara, you have served on the Board of Trustees. I think a few minutes of your perspective on the trustees, and then we can get off and running on Q&A from our audience.
Sure. Well, I'll be short. And Chris, for the record, I didn't mean to raise my hand during Ray's talk. I would never think of interrupting. But I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation, and happy to talk a little bit about my perspective from my time on the board. But I'm so happy that Tim Burnett is here, as you pointed out. Tim, I've had the pleasure of serving with Tim and learned more about good governance and leadership from Tim than just about anything else I can think of. And Hogan Medlin was a voting member of the Board of Trustees when I served, and played a key role in important decisions. And Jim Copland, I mean, just see lots of people here who have comments. So just a couple of quick things. Thinking about Mark's excellent summary of the history of governance, it occurs to me that I love thinking about the University of North Carolina having invented public education. We may also claim to have invented political interference in higher education in that case. So it's been around for centuries, right? And I'm sure the level of interference or interjection or oversight has ebbed and flowed over decades. The comment I want to make, though, thinking about where we are in this current period, there is, I think, an observable increase in the level of overt politicization of the Board of Trustees in terms of how appointments are made, and I'll circle back around to that. And some would claim, and I think I'd be part of that group, a higher level of perhaps trustees coming in with an agenda based on who appointed them, as opposed to coming in thinking about what's always in the best interest of the university. I will say, I think when I look at recent board actions, some of us might disagree with, I think it's very clear that there's no one on the Board of Trustees who doesn't love the university and care about the university. I think that's really important. Some have said differently, and I don't agree with that. I think everybody serving on the board cares about the university. I do think there may be some differences in the vision for where the university should be going. And I'll touch on a few examples of what I consider to be a little bit of an overreach. I was thinking, Mark, you also mentioned SACS, the accrediting organization, and I heard a talk recently from Dr. Belle Whelan, who is one of the leaders of SACS, and she used the phrase eyes on, hands off. And we all know that that's a marker of good governance. And recently, there have been examples where, and I'll cite a few, which we could consider a degree of micromanagement that is not helpful to the university. A couple of examples. In recent years, the elimination by the Board of Governors, the elimination of campus-based tuition increases. Those were massively important to fueling faculty salaries. And former Chancellor James Measer has talked passionately about how important that was to advancing faculty salaries. That's been a problem. The cap on tuition funds allocated to need-based aid, putting a lot of stress on the Carolina Covenant. That's been a challenge. That those are Board of Governors actions. Recently, there are examples. Mark also mentioned the deep principle of shared governance, and faculty governance is critical to that. I read recently that there was a famous speech, I think it was Dwight Eisenhower speaking at Columbia to the faculty, and he said, I'm privileged to be here speaking to employees at the university. And right away, a faculty member raised his hand and said, we are not employees of the university, we are the university. Same can be said of students, right? But I mean, faculty are what drive the university. And so that principle of respecting faculty governance is massively important. And many of you read the recent example where the faculty had recommended Nicole Hannah-Jones for a tenured appointment, and the Board of Trustees intervened in that. Now, we can all argue, there's points of view about that particular appointment, but that was out of practice. That was against the usual practice, which was to allow the faculty to have a lane and to respect that lane. There are other examples that I could cite and we could talk about later. I think just 2 points around the current issues. Chancellor Measer, others have talked about the idea of going back to, recommending that the governor appoint a bipartisan commission to study the current governance and perhaps recommend some more bipartisan, nonpartisan approaches to governance. We know Governor Cooper is supportive of that, and it'd be interesting to hear from him whether at some point whether there's an opportunity to push for that. The other point is just around the need for diversity in board appointments and allowing each university with its different needs to put forward a list of prospective trustees based on their skills, based on their leadership experience with the university, and having those appointments respected by the board of those list of preferences, those slate of candidates recommended by the respected by the Board of Governors. Recently, there are examples where that didn't happen. I'll stop there, and eager to hear from many others.
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara. Very excited to now turn this into a conversation with questions from the audience. And I think maybe I'll throw out the first question and people can raise their hands or type questions into the chat as they see fit. But the question that was on my mind as Mark was describing the broader university structure is, how does change happen with all of those bodies and all of that inertia? And I'd love to hear an example of a change that you've experienced, a positive change at the university, and how that came about through our governance structure. To any of you.
I may be the wrong person to speak about positive change for the 2.5 years I was at the university. If you look at when change occurs with respect to governance of things, it's when one party in power thinks they're going to lose power and they want to strike a better deal before the next party comes in power. And so there may be an opportunity for that in North Carolina over the next 10 years. But I do think that I'm on the community college board in North Carolina, which is a bipartisan board. And I think we function in a way that is much more diverse and respectful of opposing views because we are a bipartisan board. And so I do see that we have another model in North Carolina that works pretty well, where the governor has appointments and the General Assembly has appointments. And I think the perspectives we get from each other are incredibly helpful.
Jim.
Chris,
Barbara, I'll toss to you and then we'll hand it off to you.
No, I'm sorry. I just was going to throw out an example of positive change, and Tim Burnett could probably speak about this more than I could, but I'm thinking about back when Tim and I were both on the board and faculty salaries were a major concern. I mentioned how important that is. And there was a period there where the chancellor raised that, James Measer raised that as a priority, convinced his board that that was the priority. The Board of Trustees then worked with the Board of Governors and exerted political influence where we could to increase the level of campus-based tuition so that could fuel faculty salaries. And that's a core change that helped raise faculty salaries from, I think they were in the bottom quartile of peer institutions at that point. And then over the years that policy was in place, faculty salaries rose dramatically. That policy has now been changed, and that's a concern. I don't know, Tim, you probably have some examples of. Tim, you're on mute. Tim, still on
Tim,
mute.
you're still on mute. Can't hear you. Let's see.
Oh, well.
Can't hear you yet. Oh, there you are, Tim. You're back.
There you go.
Well, I was trying to unmute the little picture up at the top. It's that we found out that doesn't work. It's interesting when you've been around as long as I have, and Barbara less time, but as you can tell, but the playing field changes, and I'm satisfied it always will. I mean, if you go back to Mark, starting in the origin of the university, it ebbs and flows. And I've always thought the best thing we can do is get a broad section of people. And there are times when the Democrats are so firmly in power that you think the board has a particular lens they look through. And we're in a different time now, and it changes. And I think the main thing is to be certain that the power of appointment to these boards doesn't rest with just one side of the aisle. And again, that ebbs and flows. The money that Barbara's talking about, we used to, when we were on the board, we'd always talk about what does U.S. News and World Report or whomever say are the top public universities in the country. And we were always in there, and we looked across the state line at Virginia, or earlier reference to Michigan, and so forth. That is important, but you need to be careful of what you wish for, because we saw a sea change in Virginia's governance system, where the Charlottesville campus, for lack of good support, as they viewed it from the legislature, asked if they would be allowed to divorce themselves or remove themselves from all that interference by the Virginia legislature. And in return, they would not ask for nearly as much money. And in doing so, they would take care of raising their own money. And again, be careful what you wish for, because that's exactly the way they went. And the University of Virginia went from being affordable by a broad cross-section, the Charlottesville campus, a broad cross-section of the citizens, it became as expensive as most of the top tier private schools. So that worked exactly opposite of what our Constitution says we are about. So we got to be careful on that. And I don't know how you get around that, except you have governance at all levels, not just at the Board of Trustees or the Board of Governors, but right on through the faculty senate. You have a broad cross-section of people who keep a balance in there that you really need. And it ebbs and it flows. But the other thing that's not mentioned, and Mark, it has always been to me a challenge in our 16 campus system, which hadn't been around that long, honestly. Some of us are old enough to remember when that happened, but those schools have decidedly different objectives and needs of how they're governed. And you'll never get one size fits all that makes the Chapel Hill campus and Western Carolina or Pembroke or whatever. they don't have the same needs, they don't have the same mission, and it is hard to make sure they get what they need to accomplish their mission when some of the larger institutions like Chapel Hill and Raleigh are on a very different approach. I don't know. I don't have an answer to it. I wish I did. But I do know this. We can't have everybody cut out of the same piece of fabric. And secondly, we've got to be sure that all members of these governing bodies represent a broader sense of what's needed. Barbara, I had to laugh. Barbara served, as did I prior to Barbara, on the committee of the faculty that decides on awards. And you'd say, well, that's not a big deal. It isn't until you get into that committee meeting and hear them hash it out. And interestingly, the Board of Trustees had one member who sat with that committee, not on that committee, and was very supplicant to the wishes of the faculty that came in. And once in a while, we managed to get somebody who the Board of Trustees suggested might be an appropriate honorary degree recipient. But I laugh when people, what they told Eisenhower, we are the university. Larry Summers thought he was the president of Harvard, didn't he? Until he wasn't. And so the faculty has great influence, and I think there's always a balance there between Board of Trustees, which they view as being strictly political appointments and short-term, and the faculty who don't have the same feel. They very much feel what they are looking for in their school or in their department. And that changes. And I think it is the trustees and the Board of Governors who have a higher mission of not letting the pendulum swing too far in any direction. That's too much for me, but I wish it were simpler than it is. And it's a difficult time right now. And I appreciate all the people who serve on those boards. And the main thing is, I think we've got to keep spreading the background and the commitment among a broader array of people. And by the way, it's not the same at each of those 16 campuses, and shouldn't be.
Yeah. Jim, you've had your hand up for a while. Class of 94.
Sure.
Board of Trustees at one point.
Yeah, I was ex officio on the Chapel Hill board as student body president, and I'm currently serving as a trustee of Elizabeth City State University, a UNC system school in the northeast part of the state. And in terms of how to make change, I mean, I do think it's certainly possible. I mean, I do think I agree completely with Barbara when she says that I think most of the people really, the decision makers are supportive of these schools. But they're not necessarily informed about them. So I think it's a cooperative venture. And if you look at ECSU 8 years ago, I mean, ECSU was on the verge of conceivably being shut down. I mean, it was having major audit problems, plummeting matriculation rates, et cetera. And, it took, I mean, first of all, you had to have the leadership from the system. And so our current chancellor, Kerry Dixon, was sort of sent in by, I think it was Margaret Spellings at the time, it might have been Ross, initially to sort of assess what was going on. She'd been a leader within GA down in Chapel Hill, and really sort of took that over, but and it's really sort of really changed house, and the tuition levels, I mean, the matriculation levels are back up, et cetera, et cetera. You're talking about an institution less than a tenth the size of UNC-Chapel Hill, radically different sort of budget, radically different student population, but very vital to the northeastern corner of the state of North Carolina. And so to show that, I mean, there's been it's a multifaceted sort of political analysis, right? And so we've brought in Tim Moore, who was in student Congress with me, as a friend of mine, as the Speaker of the House. We brought in Phil Berger. We brought in leaders from the legislature and, of course, from the Board of Governors to sort of see what's going on and see the needs. And consistent, at least for now, it's 4 schools, Fayetteville, ECSU, Pembroke, and Western, are much more consistent with what Mark was talking about at the beginning in terms of meeting that free as far as practicable mission. I mean, they have a North Carolina Promise tuition rates that are like $500 a semester, which is, I think, even a little cheaper than Chapel Hill was when I was there. Now, the fee structures are much higher. And so another way you can sort of think about working these political dials. I mean, when I was on the trustees as the student rep, we did that. There were when Brian Lewis, who's on the call, was there 4 years before, they were trying to ratchet up tuition. He sort of fought it in Raleigh with Tuition Defense Initiative. That kept going on. And then, but they kept trying to push fees up. And if you look at some of these campuses, the North Carolina Promise campuses, the fee structures are higher than tuition structures. So I probably am on the other side of this from Barbara in terms of being able to have the universities basically set private tuition rates through fee structures and run that sort of constitutional command. But, I certainly was when I was the student body president rep at the time. And so, when the trustees, against my wishes, decided to raise various fee structures, I went down the road to the Board of Governors, called the student rep up who was on the Board of Governors, and I got the Board of Governors to kill the athletic fee increase, which got the attention of some people and got me in a shouting match with Tony Rand at the GA board, et cetera. But we changed the way fees are done. And to this day, I think at Chapel Hill, there is a joint student faculty administrative review committee for these fees and a different process for fee review before it goes to the Board of Trustees level. So, I think there are ways to do it, but you've got to be, it's not just yelling and screaming. You've got to really be sensitive to the political dynamics. These are public universities, as Charles Geralt said, that are, for the people of North Carolina, and the North Carolina taxpayers support them.
Awesome framing, and wonderful to hear you compare the work at Elizabeth City State to the work that takes place here at Chapel Hill. I'd love to send it to Allie, the question that Allie was asking. Allie Polk was asking Ray with respect to how he can get things done. So Allie, do you want to take over the mic for a moment?
Yes, thank you so much. This is building on your question a little bit earlier about examples of change that have occurred at UNC, but I think would love to know, as an alumnus and in this group of scholars and alumni, what levers can we pull to drive change and spark innovation because of against the BOG and General Assembly? The example I gave was, Ray, like, how can we advocate for you to have a vote? But I think there are other examples recently, with Project Kitty Hawk being an example of an innovation that's across the system. And I'm wondering how we as scholars and alumni can affect something like that too.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. I think it's a great question. I definitely don't have, the perfect answer to that, but I think obviously part of the challenge here, as we've heard, is just like the differing structures, right? Where the General Assembly is extremely strong in North Carolina, just like not just over the system, but just in general. We have one of the weakest governorships in the entire country. And so obviously the General Assembly, has power over a lot of different things. So it can definitely be difficult. But there are different delegated authorities, obviously, to the Board of Governors, then down to the trustees, and then down to the Chancellor, and then, throughout the system, university. So, in terms of sparking innovation, I think a lot of times, when it comes to the system, at the system level, a lot of things are typically done in-house. There is dialogue between system, Board of Governors, and universities, but it typically is at that high level, with the chancellors, with the administrators, with the Board of Trustees members. So, in terms of that, I think just being able to get involved with just university in whatever capacity that is, whether that's, getting involved with the board of visitors, whether that's, being some sort of being part of like the alumni association, just being if you're a student, being a part of student government, or just leadership in general, I think is important. I do think that, I think Tim was saying, things do ebb and flow. It does go back and forth differently. And I think the current structure, even though we've had it for the past decade, I think it will sort of shift back to, what it used to be, or what it was, prior to the current decade. And then it'll, keep changing back and forth. And I think that, short of anything monumental, that'll probably always be how it is. But in terms of the student vote issue specifically, that's also another difficult challenge because again, that's another General Assembly issue where it is in the statutes that the student member has all rights and responsibilities, but shall not have a vote. And so, that would be General Assembly issue. So, I have had conversations with different General Assembly members, including, Representative John Hardister, Speaker Tim Moore, and a few others, and just trying to, at least, if not, get that issue sort of really moving, or completed, during my tenure. I'm hoping to do one more year on the board, at least start having these conversations and, have it in the back of people's minds, show them that, the student member is, very valuable to the system in general, and that, they can be trusted to, make good decisions and have good conversations and contribute to just the welfare of the system. So.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that a little bit. I think that we could be more effective in advocating for the university and the university system if we were more targeted. So much of what I see is people saying, oh, we need to change the structure. The Board of Governors is awful. I've never convinced anybody as a lawyer for 40 years telling them they're awful. Take a given issue, and this was in the chat, there's an issue, why does our campus look so bad? Or right now, our university has about $800 million of deferred maintenance. System-wide, it's over $2 billion. The community college is about $2 billion. Post-Great Recession, we underinvested in the capital structures of our universities and our community college system. That's an initiative that almost everybody should be able to get behind that would really help. Can we go to the General Assembly and just say, let's focus on the capital needs of our universities. Let's issue some bonds. Let's do something that will, lift all boats. I think a lot of the issues that we'd like to change is completely unrealistic to think politically it's going to happen in the short term. I do think there are issues around things like admissions, tenure, capital needs, support for research. If we went in a more targeted way where we are informing people, we'd have more success. And that's one of the weaknesses sometimes of universities, that certain faculty members will say things about the Board of Governors that become the narrative, and you don't have a really well thought out, coordinated approach to the General Assembly that are less controversial, that people could get behind, and that really make a lot of sense.
Chris, can I just mention really fast that I think one avenue for continued conversation around these topics, and to Allie's question about how do we affect change, several people have formed, a bunch of people have formed the Coalition for Carolina, and maybe Emily can drop that link into the chat, but that's designed to be a forum for raising concerns and issues and for educating ourselves as alumni leaders about those issues, and for having some targeted and thoughtful and nuanced, I hope, responses, as Mark has suggested.
Mike, you've had a question, I think, for a while.
Thanks. Yes. So just very quickly, so I do research on political polarization and am now a faculty member. I was actually sworn into office by a fairly quiet, very respectable guy named Roy Cooper when he was the student attorney general. But what we're doing here, from my perspective, is really focused a little more on the micro than I would like. Maybe the micro is the way to go here. But what we really see from my perspective as a faculty member is the risk to the university of losing its reputation. So we're talking a lot about the cost of what we're charging students, but we also have to think about the benefit. And the benefit students get is that Carolina is one of the elite public institutions. Well, so was Wisconsin years ago. So was University of Texas, right? And they have lost their standing in many ways because of, in part, the kind of things that are going on here. So I have a real sense of urgency about this. I don't have a formal role. I've rolled off the GAA board. But I would say that we, I think, do need to think in a really basic way. Maybe this Coalition for Carolina is the right way. What do we do in a world in which our democratic system is not producing a governance system for the state that is representative of the preferences of our population? And our legislature is willing to exercise that gerrymandering over the university. And the cost to all of us is the value of our degree is going down over time, because the reputation of the university right now is taking a real hit. Every time one of my colleagues on the faculty sees one of these stories about interventions. And again, I'm pretty moderate politically. I wouldn't come down one side or another in some of these specifically, but the basic idea that a university can govern itself as an educational institution at a very high level affects who you can recruit from a faculty level. And if you can't recruit the best people, you lose your reputation. If you lose your reputation, it doesn't matter what you charge for your degree because you're not giving someone something that has national and global standing. So I hope we can think more over time about very fundamental ways to think about how even in a very polarized system, we might prevent some of the kinds of interventions that are occurring that I think are taking a hit at the university's academic reputation.
Amen, Mike.
Excellent. We see some wonderful comments. We're coming to the end of the hour. Questions for us to ask as Moreheads about what's our role to play in reducing political polarization, in aligning various stakeholders, in fostering meaningful conversations, not just complaints, but meaningful conversations about where the university is headed and why. And when I see the dialogue that takes place here in the foundation offices and amongst our scholars, who can often have very differing viewpoints on some of the questions that have been raised here, I tend to be highly inspired. And I wonder how we can foster similar types of dialogue in an era in which many of their peers believe that the pathway to advocacy and to change is actually through raised voices and yelling and screaming. And that's often what's modeled, to go to Dennis's point, on social media and media channels. I think this is a conversation that needs to continue. And I look forward to creating a way for us to do that. I do want to be respectful of the time of our speakers because we promised them a hard stop at 1 o'clock. And I want to also remind everyone of the opportunity that we all have to come together in October and to talk about these questions and others at our alumni forum. I have been deeply impressed by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I landed here with a mixed race family, and my first day in town was the day of the Nicole Hannah-Jones tenure fiasco. I did not know exactly what I had stepped into. What I've found, as people have talked about here, is a group of people, a wide range of stakeholders, all of whom share a singular passion for this university and for the role it plays in creating a more just, more prosperous society. And the question is, how do we ultimately get there? It forces us to balance different interests. Any decision that someone in a role like Chancellor Guskowitz makes is going to be in the interest of some stakeholders and against the interest of others. And I think for us to recognize that and to support him in meaningful ways, and to support our trustees, our governors, and to work with people like Ray in meaningful ways, is something that I really look forward to doing with all of you. Thanks for the energy, the questions that you brought, the questions that we haven't answered. I look forward to making space to answer those and others' questions in the months ahead. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to everybody. And young alumni and scholars on the call, we hope you will join us for our discussion on distinguished scholarships for all of you. It's going to be on March 25th, and Sarah has dropped a link in the chat feed for you if you want to join in and learn about scholarships you are still eligible for. Thank you to all of everyone. I can't believe our wonderful student body presidents who all showed up as well to join in and to share their thoughts in the chat. We will send the chat feed to everybody, so be looking for that. So thanks a lot. Thanks again. Thanks, Chris, for great moderating. It's fun.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.